Welcome everyone to our program today. We will be talking about minority and illiquidity discounts in the context of valuation of businesses. It's my pleasure to serve as your moderator. We'll have a brief moment here of some housekeeping items, introduce our sponsors, have a few uh, technical points before we begin, and then we'll turn it over to our panel. Our objective today is to have a robust, lively discussion amongst our valuation and legal experts. And with that, first, today's program is co-sponsored by Financial Poise. They provide education for attorneys, accountants, business owners, executives, and investors. Our other co-sponsor is the National Law Review. It's a legal news website which offers analysis on a wide range of legal and business topics. So thank you to our co-producers. Also, a brief disclaimer. We have a lively, open discussion today, but none of this is advice regarding any particular situation or matter or party. So if you would like to ask any specific questions, I'll give you the contact information of our speakers, or alternatively, uh, as usual, get your own advice. So let's meet our faculty. It's my honor and pleasure to introduce Ishak Abbott, John Schumacher, and Michael Zeb. In the slide deck, you'll see their contact information and brief bios and some additional links. Professor Abbott, he is one of our two valuation advisors and experts. He's also well published as an academic, and he is a professor of finance at University of West Virginia, based in Morgantown, West Virginia. We have John Schumacher, who is also a valuation advisor and expert, and he is a principal in the Total Point of View valuation firm based here in Chicago. And then we have a legal advisor, a lawyer who's very experienced in using valuation advisors and valuation experts in a variety of matters involving private wealth, transactions, and also litigation disputes. Michael is a partner with the law firm of Holland and Knight. Myself, I am serving as the moderator, John Levitsky. I'm very experienced in business valuation and forensic accounting disputes as well, and I am with the consulting firm of HKA based here in Chicago. So we're going to talk about minority discounts and liquidity discounts in the context of business valuation. And this is part of a series of multiple programs on the topics of valuation. This is the fourth program in our 5-program series. The next one is Valuing Your Brand and Other Soft Assets. If you'd like to register or attend this next program, you can go to financialpoise.com and do so. Also, if you'd like to listen to replays on demand of any of these 5 programs, that's also available through the financialpoise.com website. We expect that a large part of our audience, in addition to our live real-time attendees today, will be listening to this on demand. So the things that we'll talk about regarding business valuation and minority and liquidity discounts include a variety of subtopics like levels of value, standards of value, methodology, how do you assess whether you have control, lack of control, marketability, or illiquidity issues, and a variety of related points. So with that, I just want to mention the slides are there as materials for our audience. Feel free to review those for additional information. Also, feel free to use those if you'd like to take notes electronically or on the hard copy. And our focus today will be to hear from our panel. So temporarily, I will stop sharing the slides and we will go directly to our panel. And with that, I'd like to start with Mike Zeb. Mike's the attorney I mentioned from Holland and Knight. And Mike, when we hear about value of shares of stock in a private company, is value always the same as the cash price?
No. Short answer, no. When I see valuation reports, I have to remind myself that I'm seeing an estimate or someone's opinion of value. And it may be market-based, but nonetheless, it's an opinion of value, not necessarily cash that hits the pocketbook at the end of a transaction. And again, one of the more frequent standards that we see, fair market value standard, again, the word value is there, but you're also going to have to deal with the prospect of discounts because we're talking in this environment of our conversation about private companies. So the questions of liquidity of the share interests or the membership interests come up, and questions about control come up, and both of those can have a dramatic impact in terms of creating a value number, and that isn't necessarily price. I think ASOC has a view on that. Maybe he can share it.
Mike, we were talking just now, value is, in my opinion, and we may have other questions, the value is a belief at that particular point in time as to what you believe the price of this asset should be. The price is what is actually paid. Price is a fact. So that's the distinction we want to keep. And if the price and value were the same, there would be no incentive to trade.
I think I heard an example of insider trading.
If you know that the value is more than what is being offered as a price, if you're the buyer and if you believe you can get it for something which is worth much more than the price you're going to pay for it, that's a big incentive for you to do that.
Right.
More information asymmetry occurs, bigger the difference between price and value would become.
Yeah, it sort of has an impact on the hypothetical, that we use to come up with fair market value, where there's, relatively the same amount of information with the buyer and the seller. Neither of them are under compulsion, about equal access to, or have a reasonable amount of information. So you have a disparity possible there, even in a private company. I mean, it usually comes up, in securities investigations, but even in a private company, those in control may have an insight into the future of the business that the minority lacks.
Or the outsider buyer may not know.
Right. That's right.
So, Professor Abbott, there's a term in valuation literature called levels of value. What is that, and how does that relate to our topics about minority discounts, illiquidity discounts, and the like?
See, what happens is that when we say levels of value, there are at least three gradations that we can think about. The value that we observe, or the price that we observe in the marketplace, provided everything that Michael said is true, no compulsion, all information shared equally, that is what we would call the publicly traded equivalent value, PTEV. That's a term that Dan Van Vliet introduced quite a few years ago. And that is a marketable, because by definition, if the stock is being traded on a stock market, it has met the marketability criteria. It can be legally offered to investors at large. And that is a minority interest. That's our starting point. Now, if we had a marketable and a control interest, that is, the owner of that had access to the cash flows of the firm without any impediment and was able to buy and sell at will, that would be the marketable control. Value might be a little bit higher than what is being observed in the market for the non-controlling but marketable interest. Now, if we had a minority interest that had no way to access the cash flow or to effect a transfer of ownership. And it was a restricted situation, that it was not stock that was already registered and marketable on the market. That would be the third level. So the lowest will be a restricted minority stock. Then you would have the marketable minority, and then you would have the marketable control. So those are the three levels that we can start thinking about, like steps on the ladder.
Michael, you were talking about relatively equivalent availability of information. It sounded like there may be a concept of standards of value. Like, are we trying to measure fair market value with a specific definition, or is there some statute, or does that those terms seem to be in the valuation literature? What are those terms, and do those make a difference in trying to evaluate whether discounts are applicable?
Well, Isaac laid it out for us in terms of the levels. And we've been talking about fair market value, but as I haven't mentioned yet, most of my life is spent in the fair value world. And fair value, as I understand it, and in my world, is a judicial concept. It's not a hypothetical. It's a function of the specific parties that are involved in either an appraisal proceeding or a dispute. And so their conduct can have an impact on value, which isn't the case in a fair market value determination. It's fair value as a judicial concept is state specific. So you can get different interpretations of what fair value means in different jurisdictions. My jurisdiction, Illinois, does not recognize the discount for lack of control or lack of market. Some jurisdictions will, in fact, most jurisdictions won't do a discount for lack of control in a fair value proceeding. Whether you get a discount for lack of market, it could depend on, as they say, extraordinary circumstances. And it's a fun one because what's extraordinary circumstances? When I've looked at the cases, there's some kind of peculiar ones out there where a discount for lack of marketability was applied because the judge felt that the price being paid in a redemption was going to strain the company ability to continue profitably. And I'm thinking to myself, I'm not exactly sure how that's marketability. I've had another one where, John, I think you've heard me call it the FAED discount. And people have looked at me and said, where did you get FAED, F-A-E-D? I said, it's fair and equitable discount. Because what's going on in a fair value case is a judge is trying to come up with an equitable result. And equity can be on either the redeeming, the seller side or the buy side, although usually it's having more of an impact on the price being paid to the shareholder who's leaving, as it were. We had a case in John's hometown, Omaha, a case that got a lot of notoriety. But one of the interesting things in that case, in terms of the definition of fair value being specific, is that jurisdiction had a version of the Model Business Corporation Act that specifically negated those two discounts, the DLOC, the DLOM, as we say, in an appraisal proceeding, but was silent in the determination of fair value in an oppression, a shareholder fiduciary oppression type case. We were able to convince the court that they should take what is effectively the trend in the country to not do a discount for lack of control. And again, as I said earlier, you're only going to impose a discount for lack of market in extraordinary circumstances.
So if I was an owner of a closely held business and I was thinking I need a valuation, Where do I look to find out what the standard of value is?
Well, if it's appraisal and oppression, John, you're going to look to statutes and court decisions and the interpretations. And as I said, it's going to be state specific.
So if it's for estate and gift taxes, that might be different, or
Well, I would expect if it's a state and gift tax, you're going to go with the Supreme Court ruling and, the Revenue Proc, 5960. Those are all fair market value decisions.
and then you mentioned in your one case in Omaha, there was a shareholder agreement that might have some relevance as well.
Oh, there wasn't. I think I'm sort of glad there wasn't, but if there's a shareholder agreement involved, courts, the court may enforce it as written, and that's what I would generally expect. But the problem lies in how lawyers draft those documents and how, if there's a standard of value to be imposed, how they've stated it. It's all over the place at times. An Indiana case used the phrase market value. Well, was that fair market value? Was it market value to the participants? Was it some version of fair value? I mean, the Court of Appeals in Indiana saw it one way. The Indiana Supreme Court saw it differently. So if you're looking for a standard of value, it's going to be context specific. Is it an oppression case? Is it an appraisal case? If it's neither of those, then we're going to look to your industry to tell us what the standard of value is, and generally, based on the law, it's going to be fair market value.
Hey, Mike, this is John. For companies that are LLCs, is it a little bit more buttoned up typically in terms of the standard of value, or because of attorneys drafting those LLC agreements, kind of similar consideration as shareholder agreements?
Well, a couple of points, John. We don't have the body of law developed under LLCs that we have under corporations in terms of disputed values in fiduciary cases or oppression cases. You don't usually have the dissenter's rights case either. But you do, what we run into in the LLCs is, somewhat similar to what we run into in the shareholder agreements, sloppy drafting. I've advocated for years that if you're going to draft a shareholder agreement, put a standard of value in it, you ought to have someone in your industry take a look at it, because they may say anything. I mean, they may come up with a valuation technique that isn't necessarily stock market comparable company driven. There may be industry formulas. And then again, you've got to talk about the impact of the potential discounts with the parties. I mean, the real surprise is, the widow who's bought out at fair market value in a corporation her husband was a major shareholder in, and finds out she's got 30% discounts on the proportionate value because of the way it was drafted. I mean, that may be apocryphal, but it can happen.
Thank you. John Schumacher, we've heard the term a few times, minority ownership discount. What is that?
Yes, and we've already started throwing around maybe some jargon that the uninitiated might not be as familiar with, and I'll just start with the word minority. A minority doesn't mean a racial minority. It's really shorthand for non-controlling. So rather than the two words, typically, people use the word minority to indicate non-controlling. And then just the full term, minority ownership discount, one's got to think about discount off of what. So before getting to that aspect of the minority ownership discount, in general, the concept here is that in many instances, an investor is going to pay less for having less than controlling interest in a company. Not always by any means. And, we're going to get into lots of nuances here throughout this presentation. But, when you see the term minority ownership discount, it's paying less for not having full control of an entity that you're making an investment in. And then the discount part of it, discount off of what? It's off of what is a control value for the subject company, and assuming that that's readily available and out there, and there's a valuation that's done on a control basis, and then you would apply the discount to that control basis to bring it down to a minority interest level ownership interest.
But kind of put a point on it, for the audience. I'm going to invest in a company. The owner of the company thinks his company's worth $1 million, and he wants to sell me a 15% interest. He's going to want 150,000, 10% or 15% or whatever it is in the example. And the minute I put that money in to buy 15% of $1 million company, and it was priced at 150,000, what's the value potentially the next day of my interest, absent an agreement? Am I discounted?
Well, I think that I think you're teasing other slides in the deck here that we're going to get to, and the quick answer to that is I think and Ashok obviously chime in here, is it's very facts and circumstances specific. I mean, I think there is actually scenarios where that could be right, and that's what somebody would pay, and we'll get into those facts and circumstances later in this presentation.
Sorry to jump ahead.
No, that's I like it. We're teasing keep the listeners interested.
Well, Ashok, what is a discount for lack of marketability? And we also heard about illiquidity. Is a discount for lack of marketability the same as a discount for illiquidity?
See, let's look at this. What is marketability and what is liquidity? Once we define those, then only we can say what would be the discount for the absence of one of those. So first thing is, if there is a delay between the point that you offer it for sale and it actually sells, in the meantime, if there is the likelihood that the value of the asset could change, that the price that you realize may be lower than the price that you offer it at, you have a discount for lack of liquidity because there is not enough buyers available to clear that market right where and when you go and try to sell it. Now, when we start talking about marketability, that, as Mike has already introduced the concept, is jurisdictional. So it is something that would be defined under what were the regulatory constructs under which it can be put out into the market. Okay? Now, marketability is most of the time owner specific. Now, the same firm, even if it's a publicly traded firm, the affiliates and the controlling owners, they are subject to a substantially more rigorous set of restrictions, like 1% for 90 days or the 5-day volume for 90 days, only if you're not OTC. Now, in OTC, that 1% is a hard cap. If you're not registered on the market, you're not selling it on the stock market in an established exchange, you are limited to 1% per 90 days. So if you have, for example, a 10%, so if you have to wait 10 quarters to be able to liquidate it fully, each of those quarters, the 1% that you are able to liquidate during that time will attract a growing discount at the point of offer, because somebody cannot sell it for 10 quarters, 2.5 years, and a lot of things can happen during that time. So we have a basic discount for lack of liquidity, which is the price risk of holding it over that extended time. On top of that, if that liquidation cannot start right away, If we have an issue that, for example, in Reg 44, you may have a 6-month or a 1 year or a 2 year period before which you cannot even start selling that 1% per quarter. That will be added on top of the liquidity discount. So that's where we would have to see what is the applicable time period over which this liquidation can in fact be done. And therefore, what is the risk involved to the holder that can only liquidate it over a long period of time? That will become our measure of discount.
And Michael, from a lawyer's perspective, are there some courts that have used the terms a little differently, that they may have looked at illiquidity as
Right.
As something that affects all owners or the entire company, and they've looked at the discount for lack of marketability more on the individual stakeholder level?
Yeah, John, I think exactly. In the fair value world, we tend to view illiquidity as a function of the enterprise, the level of value of the enterprise. And we tend to use the phrase lack of market on the particular share interest or member interest. That's the subject matter. The question I always have when we get into that is, do I have two discounts going here? Do I get an illiquidity discount at the enterprise level, and do I have to deal with discounts yet again when I get down to a minority share position? Asak, I see you're grinning.
See, remember, we started with that publicly traded equivalent value, which is marketable and a minority interest. That's our starting point. So then, depending on that, if there is lack of liquidity in the marketplace that we can actually empirically measure, and we can see how long would it take for transfer of that ownership, and depending on how volatile that particular stock or the asset is, or the asset class is, because it may not be something that's traded itself on the market, but we are valuing it referring to some market data from similar stocks. So that's where we would have to go.
Would you not also have to take into account costs at
Yes.
the enterprise level? I mean, lawyers,
the cost of transaction, see, that's what happens in the, see, one thing we have to understand, the typical quoted price on a stock, the bid and ask price on that day, is only for a minuscule piece of that company.
right?
If you look at the level 3 quotes, that tells you at each of those bids and each of those asking prices, how much can be traded. And that's a very, very small amount.
Right.
So that's something, as soon as we start trying to sell a larger block than that $100 basic order, we do have a higher cost of trading.
Is there, John, I'm going to take your place and ask questions. Is there sort of a rule of thumb what you would expect that to be what we're calling illiquidity of a private company? I mean, are we looking at significant percentage discounts, or does it tend to be relatively small, 5% maybe? I mean, what do you see?
Depends on how liquid it is. See, it's interesting. I'm just working on analyzing the Strout restricted stock study data. And there, what I find is that the block size is less important than the level of liquidity for the stock. Now, remember, these are all publicly traded securities that they have in that market. So when we start looking at that, depending on the peer group is, remember, is pricing it as if this was publicly traded.
Right.
We are taking a beta, or we are taking any kind of measures of risk, of returns. Everything comes from those public traded data. So that's our starting point.
Right.
And we'll go up and down depending on what is happening.
I was going to pick on John next and ask him what's his experience been in terms of that notion of illiquidity discount at the enterprise level. Because John, you're primarily in the private company world like I am.
Yes. And, I think some industries, some companies, certain facts and circumstances indicate where it's going to be easier to find that buyer for that minority interest or that non-controlling interest than others. There are certain industries where businesses transact all the time, auto dealerships or medical practices or retail food, establishments. There's a whole history of, M&A activity in those industries. And I think the more activity there is, the more it's going to be easier to find that buyer. And so discounts are on the lower end of the range. For smaller companies and for companies that don't have audited financial statements, and for maybe more niche industries, it's going to be harder to find that buyer. And so in those kind of fact patterns, the discount for lack of marketability, it's significant. It can be 20, 30, 40%. And for interests that are in businesses that you see transact more at an enterprise level, it does filter down even to the minority interest level to suggest discounts in the lower end of the range. But there's still a discount there, but not to the magnitude. And every year I think our financial markets, beyond the publicly traded capital markets, the secondary markets and the market for private companies, courtesy of private equity and courtesy of family offices and courtesy of hedge funds, going beyond public companies. The depth of buyers out there in the marketplace, today is a heck of a lot more than it was 5 years ago, and I suspect 5 years from now it'll be even deeper into the private markets. And I don't think you can pick up the newspaper without hearing, about big banks getting bigger into the private market industry investments.
So with that, that's a good point to transition to some discussion of data. Is there empirical data? And John Schumacher, you put together a few slides with some examples about IPO and restricted stock data and publicly traded companies. So I'd like to take a couple of minutes, and John, if you could just very briefly point out for our viewers some highlights of these examples, and then one other way to quantify, among others, potential discounts for this. There is the use of option-based models. So we'll ask Professor Abbott in a few minutes after, John, you walk us through a few of these examples to give us a perspective from option-based model quantifications as well. So I put up on the screen the slides. You put together first this example from IPO data, and then you have some things about restricted stocks and some public stock data here. So we just take a few minutes in here and walk our audience through this. We'd appreciate it.
Yeah, and you're starting at the slide I'd like to start at, a company called Tesla that I suspect a few people have heard of. Back when they went public in 2010, on specifically, as you can see here, on June 28, 2010, they came out at an IPO price of $17. Prior to that, in approximately 117 days prior to that, they issued stock to presumably, employees, probably senior level executives. And they did that based on a valuation that was done, by one of my peers, maybe Ashok. I'm not sure who did the work. But when they granted those stock options or even maybe restricted stock to their employees, they granted them at a price of $9.96 a share. And most companies want to issue, stock options and restricted stock at market. So that was at a price of $9.96. So when you do the math on that and you say, well, 117 days is not a lot of time for the fundamentals of Tesla to change, you do the math and you say, well, that indicates a discount of, an IPO premium of 70%. And then the inverse of that is a discount of 41% and change. So that's a pretty big discount. And so, yeah, I think you got to, though, take it with a grain of salt, because in a dynamic industry like electric vehicles, actually 117 days is actually a decent amount of time. And then you also got to think about kind of the, how robust is that valuation, in all candidness, for when the stock grant to the employees was done. That wasn't, a road show like is done for an IPO. I mean, that's a valuation, expert coming in, or practitioner coming in and doing a fundamental business valuation over a month's time. And he or she is not necessarily incentive to go high on the valuation, to be candid. So you got to take these IPO stock studies with a grain of salt, but that's a data point that's out there. The next one, I think, John, is on restricted stock studies. And that's a better one, I think, in my own judgment. And Ashok and Mike, please feel free to agree or disagree. But the restricted stock studies, this is a company that's already publicly traded, and they need to raise additional capital, and they do so via issuing restricted stock, where the buyer cannot sell the shares for typically a couple of years time period. So they're locked in for 2 years. And in most cases, the price that the restricted stock price that the investor pays is below what the prevailing public share price is immediately before the announcement of that restricted stock sale. So doing the math on that discount, it implies here a 16.9% discount for having those owning those shares that are locked up for X number of years. Another little nuance here to this type of issuances is many times these companies are distressed. So there may be some information asymmetry, to use a term that Ashok had mentioned earlier, that could impact things, and that wouldn't necessarily be appropriate to capture in your discount for lack of marketability. And then also a lot of times restricted stock investors receive warrants, which is another word for stock options in the company. And some studies adjust for that, some don't, and it's kind of, you've got to look at each transaction and make sure you make adjustments for the impact of the buyer here getting warrants in the transaction.
And what about the public stock data example you put
My
in?
favorite example on this topic, Berkshire Hathaway. And as Mike mentioned, I'm from Omaha, Nebraska. And so I love to pose to people when they think about, well, yeah, the publicly traded stock of Berkshire Hathaway or any publicly traded company, when you observe those stock prices, minute to minute, day after day, month after month, those are trading of minority interests in the subject company. And so when investors are buying Berkshire Hathaway, in this case, it was a few years ago when we prepared this chart, Berkshire A shares were trading at $491,000 and change for a share of Berkshire A. And so my question for people to noodle on, and I obviously have my own opinion, is, are investors, when they make that $491,000 purchase of a Class A share of Berkshire, are they saying, well, I would have paid $500,000 for the share if I controlled Berkshire Hathaway and Warren Buffett didn't? Or are they saying, no, I'm actually, excited that he's running Berkshire Hathaway and doing a phenomenal job for investors. And so I'd actually, I'll pay the market price. There is no discount in arriving at how I'm getting at my price. So I think it's a good one to think about, whether publicly traded stocks, trade at a discount to control or not. And I think that gets to, some of the reasons why, Dan Van Vliet, as Ashok mentioned earlier, came up with the, publicly traded equivalent value to create the nuance here, that maybe some stocks are trading, at not much of a discount to on a controlling basis.
And then what about Tootsie Rolls?
Yeah, this is another fascinating one. So this example here is, the CEO of Tootsie Roll at the time was in his 80s and had been the CEO and chairman of the company for like 40, 50 years. And maybe unlike Warren Buffett, based on the share price of Tootsie Roll over time, it didn't appear that investors were real enamored with him to continuing to be running Tootsie Roll into his late 80s or early 90s, as I recall. And when he passed away, the stock price shot up. So, the Tootsie Roll Industries here may be more of I'll call it a traditional case or non-traditional for public companies, but traditional in the sense that most people think, well, you'd pay less for a minority interest. And this case, when the shareholder, CEO, chairman died, he owned a significant part of the company. So the minority shareholders were presumably getting more control over the company and control, in a new CEO. So this kind of shows more the private company consideration of yes, you would pay less for a minority interest.
Well, thank you. We mentioned that Professor Abbott has done some published research on some other ways to look at these types of discounts. And Ashok, you're published on the topic of option-based models. So are there some insights from your experience and research that you'd like to share regarding these discounts?
Sure. That's something I've been doing for about 35 years now. Really enjoy that. See, it's interesting that the exchange option models and the Black-Scholes option models were in fact introduced at the same point in time in the same publication. I mean, JF, Journal of Finance, 1978, is when both of the papers were published. Okay. The difference is in between those is there's a big significant difference. When you buy a Black-Scholes option, you're buying an option. Whether you exercise it or not in future is your choice. And you pay a small amount of the option premium. And in exchange for that, you receive the right, but not the obligation to buy that or sell that stock at that time in future. So the capital you commit is a very small amount. In case of exchange option, which we call the Margrave exchange option, William Margrave wrote that paper, just like Scholes wrote the first paper. You actually own an asset which you agree to exchange at a future date for the other asset. For example, in our case, with restricted stocks, that's a much closer comparison. Because when you buy a stock which is restricted from trading at this point in time, you are not going to get cash price that is guaranteed at that point in time. With a Black-Scholes option, you have a guaranteed cash price that you will receive if you decide to sell it in future. However, in case of a restricted stock, once the period of restriction is over, the moth becomes a butterfly. So what you have at that point is the unrestricted stock. However, very important, very critical, that restricted stock does not have a guaranteed price. You don't know in advance what the price of the unrestricted stock will be when the period of restriction goes away. And you don't have the option of not converting the restricted stock into unrestricted stock, because the value of unrestricted stock is always going to be more than the value of restricted stock at any point in time. So that's the Margrave exchange options is the framework. And it's interesting, in valuation, 1995, when Longstaff put that small note, 2.5 pages in JF, as a suggestion that an exchange option may be a good way to value the difference between restricted and unrestricted stock, which 6 years later, when he kept working on this, 2001, he wrote a full blown paper where he showed how the two would be exchanged for each other and what the discount would be if we had to price one asset in relation to the other. Now, remember, when we do an exchange option, we are not valuing the restricted stock on its own. We are valuing that restricted stock as a proportion of the unrestricted stock value. And therein lies the confusion. Say what happened was in valuation practice, some people just ran with the 1995 paper and said, oh, that's very wonderful. If the unrestricted stock is worth 2 shares of the restricted stock, then the discount is 100%. 2 minus 1 is 1. In reality, if you think about it, if you are buying 2 for 1, the discount is 50%. And that's a point that was missed by the early individuals that started applying or trying to apply the Longstaff model. And then after that, a couple of modifications of that came along, like Finnerty wrote his Asian average model, which is the same thing as the both are exchange options. So since they just ran with the concept without thinking about what it is, and that's why it took Longstaff 6 years to go through all the math of it and say, what is the discount? The discount is not the difference between the price of the unrestricted stock and restricted stock as a proportion of the restricted stock. Now, when 1 for 2 happens, the discount is equal to the value of the restricted stock that you're paying, not the unrestricted stock, which was at value 2. So that is something that got missed in translation somewhere. So we have some people coming in and saying, oh, the option models don't work because they give you 100% or more than 100% discount. In fact, it's very interesting. Hitchner in his book has a set of tables where he shows that the discount is 270%. Now, just think about it. A discount of more than 100% would mean that it is so toxic that you have to pay someone some amount of money to take this asset, take this restricted stock off of your hands. Is that possible? Would you do that? And that's kind of where the gap in understanding has happened. It is getting corrected. I mean, we are doing work with that. The 2003 paper, 2023 paper I had with JFAR, there I walked through that distinction, and I've known Longstaff for a long time, since 2012 or so, and I sent that paper to him to look at. I said, am I interpreting this correctly? And he wrote back, he said, yes, this is a very well done explanation. This is the way I intended it in 2001 and put it in, so it's the same. Theoretically, this is a good correction to what the practice has been. So we'll see gradually as it starts getting accepted.
Well, thank you, Professor Abbott. John Schumacher, when you were walking us through data, you mentioned something that sounded like the financial condition of the company in one of those situations. So I wanted to ask you, when these types of discounts that we're discussing are being evaluated, does the financial condition and solvency of the subject company make any difference?
Yeah, absolutely, John. And both on the discount for lack of control and the lack of marketability. And I know Mike's eyes lit up and he's going to say double counting, or, how do you ensure for not double counting? And that is a challenge to do so. But one of the ways I avoid the double counting aspect is to perform a valuation when I'm valuing a minority interest, is to value the minority interest. So what are the cash flows that the minority interest is going to receive? Particularly via discounted cash flow analysis. Doesn't work with a market approach, merger and acquisition method, because you're observing controlling interest. But for a discounted cash flow analysis, you can say, you can model specifically what you think your minority interest cash flows are going to be, based on history and based on what information that's available in the facts and circumstances. And then separately, on the lack of marketability, then you can make considerations, for how long is it expected before the investment would be harvested, if it's a private equity backed company, or if it's a company that seems to have a finite life, and if it has an indefinite life, what kind of distributions are you going to be getting, or dividends are you going to be getting as a minority shareholder, and you factor that into the discounts. But long story short, the more a company's insolvent, the more it's performing poorly, the more that management's not doing its job, the bigger the discounts are for both control and marketability. And there's ways to make sure then that we don't do the double counting in the valuation. Is that all right, Mike?
Right.
Michael, I was going to ask, you want to share from your experience where the most common potential areas for double counting these types of discounts arise?
Some of my favorite conversations. But I did want to tease John for a moment about when he takes projections for his DCF. Who did those projections? And I think we're going to talk about that in a minute, but I'm giving you a head start on a control versus a minority projection on cash flows. But back to John's point, it's when we see these, we're given projections, the appraiser is given projections, taking a look at them, and then doing something called normalizing them, taking a look at the kinds of decisions that a controlling person could make and a minority can't make or influence, where we're valuing that minority's position. And what I run into is a minority-based projection on which a discount for lack of control is layered. And I think that's double counting. I know, John, you agree, but it's one of those things where you got to keep an eye on that one. My favorite one is, we have these company-specific risk premium. These are small companies, they're not public. You start doing all the modeling and you start getting into, there are some aspects of this company that maybe warrant an additional risk premium, like thin management, not audited, accounting systems are off, supplier customer concentrations. And what worries me at times is when you start comparing those company-specific items with size premium, and you're looking at companies that maybe in the 9 and 10 decile, which I hope one of you guys can explain, I'm running into overlap where I'm seeing people taking, the discount that's baked into the size, and they're layering it on the company's specific risk premium on top of it. To me, that looks like double dipping. I think
it very much is. See, that's where we have a lot of overlap, especially between any kind of liquidity and the size premium.
Because John Levitsky, I have to run and get a charger from my computer. It'll take me a minute.
Okay, we will continue.
Got you.
So as we're coming down to the last a few minutes here, and as we put this all in context, our discussion. We are delivering this program live at the end of May, on May 29th of 2025. And during the first few months, especially the last couple of months of this year, April and May, the two most recent months, there's been increased volatility in the stock market. There also have been political changes in the U.S. regarding a variety of topics, and so in these last few minutes, I'd like to open it up to John Schumacher and Professor Abbott and Michael Zeb, if you'd like to take a minute or two and just share with us some contextual insights. Do these types of changes in eras where there's suddenly increased stock market volatility and some new political direction, do they make a difference in considering these types of discounts?
Yeah.
John, you want to start?
Yeah. It's such an easy question, John.
Easy question. Yeah, the answers may be different than easy.
Yeah. No, it makes valuation harder than so. I guess is what I'm insinuating, but then it also points to why a good valuation analysis can help bridge these seeming disconnects, and a good valuation defined by multiple approaches. So you might be able to get your discounted cash flow analysis to provide one indication of value, and then what the market is telling you is something else. And the market may be more taken by what's the latest in terms of the new tariff regime or the latest injunction issued by a judge. And so you're getting that view fully impounded from your market approach. Whereas in your discount cash flow analysis, you can take a longer term view on things to say that there may be some irrational exuberance or some irrational fears that are being baked into our market approach. But nonetheless, I mean, there's a consideration. There's a lot of people voting with their pocketbooks in the market approach. So a good valuation is going to reconcile that market approach with your longer term view and your discount cash flow analysis, to hopefully come up with a supportable, reasonable valuation. But those two, I think, potentially in the current environment are getting more divergent, and when they're more divergent, it's a harder valuation.
Professor Abbott, would you like to share some insights?
That's the same situation that we are really talking about the intrinsic value and the market price at a given point in time. Markets typically tend to overreact in the short run. So we have this pendulum swinging up and down around the right price. So that's the kind of thing that we have to be aware of. Are we looking at it from the point of view of a day trader? Are we looking at it from the point of view of an investor? Are we looking at a 5-year, 10-year horizon, or are we looking at a 5-day horizon? The two numbers are going to be different. So that's where that dichotomy between price and value becomes very big when these rapid changes are occurring. There's a lot of uncertainty. Uncertainty is risk. Risk means that the price will be lower at that point in time than what it should be in the long run.
And have there been some prior historic examples, like the Great Recession of 2008?
2008 is a very good example. In the last quarter of 2008, we had prices change very quickly, and they were plummeting. But by the end of 2009, second quarter, a lot of that lost ground was made because the economy got stabilized. So if you're taking a long-term view, the value did not change too much, but the prices did.
Yeah, and I love that example, and it brings me back to one of my favorite companies, Berkshire Hathaway. And in the height of the financial crisis, Goldman Sachs stock, I think, started trading below $10 a share, and they were very concerned about what a price sub $10 a share meant. And so they went to Berkshire Hathaway and to Warren Buffett and said, we need an injection of capital here to calm the financial markets here, to let them know that we're not going anywhere. And Berkshire made that investment. And I think within a year, Goldman Sachs' stock had been, was trading at higher than it far higher than it had been, or after the severe decline during the heart of the financial crisis.
General Motors, same thing.
Yeah.
So we're almost to the end of our time period. And Michael Zeb, we were just talking with John Schumacher and Professor Abbott about current volatility and political dynamics and whether they may have an effect on price or value and these types of discounts. And so we heard from each of them, and wonder here in the last minute or so, Michael, would you like to offer up some observations of your own on that topic to put everything we've discussed really in the current market topic context?
Well, the first thing is, I apologize. It wasn't just the battery went down. My network cut out on me. It's a new network. I won't tell you the name of the company, but we're not happy with them. But a court renders a decision, creating even more uncertainty in the marketplace. And then I wonder, as the non-valuation expert, how do you value things? I've seen public companies pulling back their forecasts. And if a court decision tomorrow comes down and they pull back their forecast, where's that leave all of you all in trying to come up with a value statement? I mean, do you do one at noon and then 2:00 in the afternoon? I don't know how that works right now. It's for me, other than I know some experience, John, you had during COVID. For me, it's just a great deal of uncertainty.
Well, thank you.
That's the non-expert lawyer perspective right now. I'm just confused.
Well, we appreciate the insights of all of our speakers. Thank you very much to John Schumacher, Professor Abbott, and Attorney Michael Zeb. And most of all, thank you to all of our viewers and listeners. We're glad that you are here, whether you're here on demand or whether you're here real time during our premiere of this program. And in your materials, as I pointed out at the outset, the brief bios for each of us is there, and also our contact information is there. If you'd like to reach out to any of us directly, feel free to do so. And with that, thank you again. And financialpoise.com website contains information on how to attend future webinars, and we look forward to seeing you again in the future. This concludes today's program, and take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.